You know, when you break your arm, an X-ray gives you this perfectly clean, like binary answer. You hold up that black film to the light and you see the jagged white line of the bone and the doctor just points and says, there it is, broken.
Right, it's undeniable, it's visible.
Exactly. It's incredibly comforting because it's visible and categorized. But human morality doesn't come with an X-ray machine.
Oh, definitely not.
When you step into the world of human psychology, of social dynamics, of ethics behind closed doors, we are dealing with some really diagnostic muddy waters. And today on the deep dive, we've taken a stack of incredible sources unpacking a 3,000-year-old narrative.
Yeah, specifically from the Quran, Surah Yusuf, verses 25 through 35.
Right. But our mission today is not to just read this as like a piece of ancient history or a theological text. We're going to show you how this narrative is actually an absolute masterclass in forensic deduction, in linguistic analysis, and in what we're going to call social physics.
It really is an unparalleled case study.
Yeah.
We're going to take you from a locked room in this luxurious ancient Egyptian palace straight into the cold stone reality of a dungeon.
Yeah, quite the transition.
Huge transition. And the connective tissue between those two extremes is all about what happens when pure logic and irrefutable physical evidence are forced into a collision course with a deeply corrupt, image-obsessed power structure.
I mean, the setup here has all the tension of a modern true crime thriller crossed with a high-stakes corporate PR scandal.
Absolutely.
Picture the scene, right? You have a perfectly sealed, locked room. You have an incredibly powerful, elite woman, the wife of the governor. She wields massive social and political influence.
He holds all the cards.
Right. And you have an enslaved man, Yusuf, who is in the most vulnerable position imaginable, structurally speaking. And suddenly, the silence of that room is shattered by a frantic, desperate physical race to the door.
It is a profoundly claustrophobic and intense environment. But what makes this deep dive so crucial is how the sources unpack the mechanics of what happens next.
Yeah.
We're going to explore how a violently torn piece of fabric becomes, well, what might actually be the earliest recorded instance of circumstantial physical evidence.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. We are also going to completely deconstruct a very famous, very misunderstood banquet scene. One that usually gets translated as this gory horror movie.
Yeah, I've always heard it told that way.
Right, but we're going to reveal it as a brilliant metaphor about psychological paralysis.
And perhaps the most counterintuitive part of this entire journey, and we really want you listening to think about this, we're going to look at the cold, hard social physics of why a perfectly rational, innocent man would actively choose to go to prison.
Right, a man who has undeniable forensic evidence proving his absolute innocence.
Exactly. Why would he intentionally choose to walk away from a palace and step into a prison cell?
It's a study in how a corrupt system processes truth that it simply cannot afford to acknowledge.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning, because before we can even get to the crime scene, the race to the door, or the forensic evidence, our sources spend a significant amount of time establishing why the crime did not happen in the first place.
That's a crucial foundation.
Right. We have to understand the internal mechanics of the room. It's just Yusuf and the governor's wife. There are no witnesses.
No hidden cameras.
Absolutely no external policing mechanism at all. Furthermore, she is in a position of ultimate authority over him. She gives him a direct, unequivocal command to be with her. Every single external barrier to this transgression has been removed. But he resists.
And this is where the source material introduces a truly profound psychological and spiritual distinction. To understand his resistance, the text breaks down the critical difference between two specific concepts, Zikr and Burhan.
Now, when a lot of people hear the word Zikr, particularly in a modern context, they immediately think of, like, physical chanting, right?
Yeah, that's the common association.
Yeah. They picture someone sitting with a rosary, mechanically repeating a phrase like Allahu over and over again, maybe hundreds or thousands of times.
Well, the source offers a very sharp, almost surgical critique of that exact modern interpretation. It points out a massive, glaring contradiction in how society views religious remembrance.
How so?
The text argues that you can have someone who sits in a mosque or in a private gathering flawlessly and rhythmically chanting for hours. They're vocalizing the words perfectly. And the assumption is that this repetition is the ultimate armor against sin.
Right, like a spiritual force field.
Exactly. But the source asks us to look at reality. The moment that same person steps out of that spiritual environment and back into the real world, the moment they are presented with an unobserved opportunity for bribery or a secret financial transgression.
Or just any act of moral corruption, really.
Right. They often jump right into it.
Because the chanting didn't actually change their internal wiring. It was a physical habit, not a psychological transformation.
That's exactly it.
The external noise didn't translate into an internal break pad.
Right. If that mechanical repetition was true Zikr, it would act as an automatic break when temptation strikes. But it so often doesn't. And that brings us to the superior concept introduced in the text, which is Burhan.
Burhan.
Yeah. The sources translate Burhan as a divine proof, or, more functionally, a deeply internalized, unbreakable moral compass.
Okay, but I have to push back here. I need to play devil's advocate for a second because I know what you, listening right now, might be thinking.
Okay, go for it.
Yusuf is a prophet in this narrative. So it is incredibly easy for an outsider to look at this story and say, well, of course he resisted. He's a prophet. He basically has a divine cheat code.
Right, the infallibility argument.
Exactly. It's easy to assume he has some sort of magical biological immunity to temptation. Like, his programming simply doesn't allow for the possibility of mistake. If the brake hits itself automatically, where is the human struggle?
That is the exact assumption our source material attacks head-on. And it is a brilliant point to raise. The text explicitly, forcefully argues against viewing prophets as infallible, emotionless robots.
Which makes sense, logically.
Let's follow the logic. If prophets were simply programmed without the capacity to feel human biological desire, then their resistance would be entirely meaningless. What is the moral victory in a machine refusing to eat a piece of chocolate cake?
Right. The machine doesn't have taste buds.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't want the cake. There is no triumph there.
A firewall blocking a virus isn't making a moral choice, it's just executing code. If Yusuf is just executing divine code, this isn't a story about morality, it's just a story about predetermined destiny.
Precisely. And the source makes it abundantly clear. Yusuf possesses a completely intact, fully functioning human nature. He is a young man in the prime of his life.
He's human.
Fully human. He is fully capable of feeling the human pull, the intense biological and psychological temptation of that specific, highly charged moment. In fact, the textual phrasing acknowledges that the natural human inclination was present in the room. But, and this is the critical defining pivot, his Burhan overrides it.
So the Burhan isn't the absence of temptation. It's the mechanism that processes and rejects the temptation. It's the ultimate internal CCTV.
Yes, but it operates on a much deeper level than just feeling like an invisible supervisor is watching you. Burhan is the profound, unshakable internalization of the reality of consequence. Is what happens when ethical values are so deeply ingrained in your psyche that they become your default operating system. When the temptation spikes in that locked room, Yusuf's Burhan doesn't just flash a red peace sign, it instantly projects the comprehensive consequences of the act.
And not just the legal or social consequences, because remember, those don't exist in this room, she's not going to tell, and there are no witnesses. The source used an analogy here that I thought was absolutely staggering in its simplicity. It introduced the concept of the law of retribution, or in the original terminology, mukafat EML.
Yes, the unavoidable cause and effect.
It's all about that. The text uses the physical example of ingesting poison.
It's a brilliant conceptual tool.
Think about it. If you choose to swallow arsenic, you do not need a police officer standing next to you to arrest you. You do not need a judge to slam a gavel and sentence you.
No, the punishment is biologically built into the act itself.
Right. The violent stomachache, the destruction of your internal organs, the system failure, that is the mukafat EML, the consequences inextricably bound to the action.
The poison doesn't care if you swallowed it in public or in a completely dark, locked room. The biological reaction is identical. The consequence is automatic.
Exactly. And true internal law, true Burhan, is reaching a level of psychological clarity where you understand that moral corruption works the exact same way.
It's spiritual physics.
Yes. If you commit an act of ethical decay, even if the doors are triple locked, even if society never ever finds out, you have ingested a spiritual and psychological poison. The degradation of your own character, the shattering of your internal peace, the permanent fracturing of your integrity. That consequence is built in.
You cannot outsmart it. You cannot hire a PR firm to spin it away from your own conscience.
So bringing this directly to you, the listener, this is the ultimate diagnostic test of your own character. What do you do when the world's cameras are turned off?
That's the real test.
When you are looking at a scenario where with absolute 100% certainty that you could cut a corner, take the money, betray a trust, and absolutely get away with it socially, do you have a Burhan?
Do you recognize the poison for what it is?
Right, even if it is beautifully packaged and handed to you on a silver platter by someone in power?
That is the defining question of the human experience. Yusuf recognized the poison. His Burhan illuminated the reality of the act beyond the heavy, immediate fog of temptation. And because he sees the poison clearly, his reaction isn't just a polite refusal.
No, it is immediate physical action.
Which brings us to the explosion of kinetic energy in that room. He doesn't just say, "No thank you, ma'am," and slowly back away.
Right. The physical reality escalates from 0 to 100 in a microsecond. He makes a desperate, full-blown sprint for the door, and this sets up the actual crime scene.
The sources draw our attention to a very specific, highly charged Arabic word used in the text here.
Istabaqa.
Yes. This isn't just a word for running. It translates to competing with one another to reach a destination first. It is a race.
It's a frantic scramble. Think about the geometry of the room. He is sprinting toward the heavy locked door, trying to get there fast enough to unlatch it and escape.
And she is right behind him.
Right. She is sprinting right behind him, trying to get to the door first to physically block him to keep it secured.
Yeah.
It is a high-stakes physical struggle. And right at the very climax of this race, just as they reach the threshold, the door swings open.
Talk about bad timing.
Unbelievable timing. And standing right there on the other side, completely unannounced, is the master of the house, the governor, the husband.
It is the absolute ultimate collision. The darkest, most secret, private reality violently crashing into public authority.
And here's where the text turns into a masterclass in human psychology, or perhaps more accurately, the terrifying cunning of self-preservation.
Oh, her reaction is fascinating.
Think about how a normal person reacts when caught in a highly compromising, deeply shocking situation. Your brain usually misfires. You freeze, you stutter.
You try to stammer out an excuse or physically back away.
Yeah.
The instinct is almost universally defensive. You try to explain why things aren't what they look like.
But she doesn't do that. Her reaction is staggeringly fast. In a fraction of a second, before her husband can even process the visual information in front of him, she preemptively strikes.
She goes instantly on the offensive.
Yes. She points at Yusuf, looks at her husband, and demands, "What is the punishment for someone who intended evil against your wife?"
It is a breathtakingly manipulative maneuver. In one breath, she completely seizes control of the narrative. She isn't just denying guilt, she is instantly appointing herself as the victim, the judge, and the jury.
All before anyone else can even speak.
Exactly. She is demanding a sentence before trial has even begun. And notice what she is really doing here. She is leveraging her husband's ego.
How so?
She is demanding that he act on his protective honor, his social standing as a powerful man whose property, his household and his wife, has allegedly been threatened by his servant.
Wow, she weaponizes the power dynamic immediately. And look at where this leaves Yusuf. He is standing there, an enslaved man, a foreigner with zero social capital, up against the breathless, furious accusation of the most powerful, elite woman in the household.
From a sociological standpoint, he is already dead.
Yeah, it is his word against hers.
Yeah.
And critically, there is no third person in that room who actually saw what happened prior to the door opening.
Which creates an impossible legal dilemma for the ancient justice system.
Yeah.
In traditional jurisprudence of that era, and frankly in many eras, you need a witness.
You need someone who saw it.
Right, you need an eyewitness who can verbally testify to the sequence of events. Without an eyewitness, power and social standing dictate the truth. The powerful win.
But then our sources highlight something truly revolutionary happening in the narrative. A witness from her own household, an advisor or a relative of hers, steps forward.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
And what is so brilliant here is that this person doesn't offer testimony based on what they saw, because they weren't inside the locked room either. Instead, they offer a mechanism for logical deduction.
It is the formal introduction of circumstantial evidence into the narrative. The realization that the physical environment itself can act as an unbiased witness.
I have to say, I read this part of our sources 3 times because my mind was blown. I was totally geeking out over this. This is a 3,000-year-old text outlining the exact foundational principles of crime scene investigation.
It is ancient CSI.
It's forensic physics. We are so used to watching procedural shows where they analyze, blood spider angles or bullet trajectories, and here is the exact same logical framework being applied millennia ago.
Let's walk through the exact physical test this household witness proposes, because the logic is airtight.
Yeah, the witness looks at the chaos, looks at the two people panting at the door, and says, essentially, stop yelling and look at the physical evidence. Look at Yusuf's shirt.
Physical struggle left its mark.
Right, during the frantic race to the door, his shirt was torn. The witness lays out a flawless, binary, logical diagnostic. They say, if the shirt is torn from the front, the Arabic word used is kubul, then the physics of the encounter tell a specific story.
Very clear story.
Exactly. A tear from the front means they were facing each other. It means he was advancing on her, and she was physically defending herself, pushing him away by his chest, grappling with the front of his garment to keep him at bay.
It's the mechanical reality of a frontal assault. If he is coming at her, her hands are on his chest, the fabric tears in the front.
Exactly. The witness says if it's torn from the front, she is telling the truth, and he is the aggressor. But then the witness flicks the hypothetical.
The alternative.
Right. However, if the shirt is torn from the back to bar, then the laws of physics demand an entirely different narrative. It means his back was turned to her. It means he was running away from her, trying to escape, and she was the one actively pursuing him, grabbing the back of his shirt in a desperate attempt to pull him back into the room.
If the tear's on the back, she cannot be the victim of an assault. You cannot be assaulted by someone running away from you.
It is a perfect, undeniable binary test. The physical evidence is completely devoid of emotional manipulation. The shirt doesn't care about her social standing.
Not at all.
The shirt doesn't care that Yusuf is a slave. The torn fabric cannot be bribed, and it cannot lie.
So the husband, the governor, looked at the evidence, and the text confirms the shirt is torn from the back.
Wow.
The forensic physics speak louder than the wife's frantic accusations. Yusuf is factually, empirically, logically proven innocent, and the wife is factually proven guilty of both the attempted transgression and the subsequent false accusation.
The logical trial is over. The verdict is carved in stone. He won.
But
Yeah, exactly. But as you listening are about to see, there is a terrifying chasm between proving your innocence with flawless logic and actually surviving the social fallout of that truth in a corrupt system,
because winning the argument doesn't mean you win your freedom.
which forces us to confront a really harsh, really uncomfortable sociological reality that our sources deeply analyze: the apathy of the elite. We have to look at the immediate aftermath of this forensic revelation.
Right, let's put ourselves in the husband's shoes for a moment. He's the governor. He represents the pinnacle of law, order, and justice in this society.
He's the guy in charge.
He has just been presented with irrefutable scientific-level proof that his own wife attempted to coerce a servant into a sexual act, and when caught, immediately tried to frame that innocent man for a capital crime. By all metrics of normal human behavior, you would expect a volcanic eruption of outrage.
You would expect a massive demand for justice.
You would expect severe consequences.
But the source text stops us and points out that we have to fundamentally understand the specific type of society we were dealing with. This is a highly civilized, incredibly affluent, elite Egyptian society.
They have massive wealth, they have refined manners, they have high culture, art, and complex political structures.
Right, but underneath that shiny veneer, the source argues they are morally hollowed out. They have suffered a complete erosion of a vital internal mechanism, a concept the text refers to as kairat.
This is a crucial concept. Let's spend some time defining kairat, because if you just look it up in a standard dictionary, it often gets lazily translated as jealousy, which completely misses the point here.
Yeah, it's so much deeper than that.
It's a very robust, multidimensional term. In this context, kairat is much closer to the concept of protective honor or righteous indignation.
Right.
It is that visceral, moral outrage you feel when something sacred, ethical, or innocent is violated. It is the instinctual fire in the belly that makes a person stand up against injustice, especially when that injustice occurs in their own domain, on their own watch.
And what happens when a society loses that?
Well, the source makes a profound sociological argument here. When an entire society or an elite ruling class slowly loses its kairat, it doesn't suddenly become violent or barbaric. It becomes numb.
Numb? What?
It becomes a walking corpse of a culture where preserving comfort and social standing matters infinitely more than enforcing the truth.
They stop caring about what is right and only care about what is convenient. And the husband, the governor, is the absolute terrifying embodiment of this deadened kairat.
He really is.
Look at his actual recorded reaction to seeing the torn shirt and realizing the staggering magnitude of his wife's betrayal and false accusation. He doesn't call for the guards. He doesn't express fury at his wife.
He doesn't apologize to Yusuf.
No. He just looks at Yusuf, the victim, and says, Yusuf, turn away from this.
Basically, pretend this never happened. Move on.
And then he casually turns to his wife, who just tried to orchestrate a man's execution to cover her tracks, and he says, and you, ask forgiveness for your sin.
That is the entirety of his justice.
Hey, let's just drop it, and you should probably apologize. It's wild.
The source uses a very evocative, earthy Punjabi phrase to describe this specific mentality of the elite class. Palmiti. It literally translates to throw dirt on it, bury it under the soil, conceal the mess.
It is the ancient equivalent of aggressive PR management. And if we pull this thread into the modern day, it is chillingly relevant.
Oh, completely.
Think about the massive institutional cover-ups you read about in the news every single year. How many times have we seen this exact same dynamic play out in modern power structures?
In massive multinational corporations.
Or in powerful political dynasties, in elite universities or religious institutions. When a massive scandal breaks behind closed doors, when there is undeniable physical or digital proof of severe wrongdoing by a high-ranking executive against a vulnerable subordinate, what is the institution's first instinct?
History and modern journalism show us that their first instinct is almost never to seek justice for the victim.
Never. Their first instinct is containment. The executives get in a room and ask, how do we manage the PR fallout? How do we protect the stock price? How do we shield the brand? How do we maintain the status quo?
In those rooms, the truth is not a guiding light. The truth is a massive liability.
And that is exactly what the governor is doing. He does not care about the objective truth of the torn shirt. He cares about his subjective reputation in the Egyptian high society.
Acknowledging his wife's guilt publicly, taking actual disciplinary action, would result in a massive, messy public scandal.
It would make him look foolish, weak, or out of control of his own household.
Exactly. It would disrupt the delicate social order of his elite circle. So he chooses the path of least resistance. He chooses to bury it.
And in doing so, he expects Yusuf, the victim who has just endured extreme trauma and a terrifying false accusation, to simply absorb the pain, swallow the injustice, and stay quietly obedient for the sake of the household's public relations strategy.
It's a heavy burden to put on the innocent party.
The irony is absolutely suffocating. Yusuf played by their rules. He went to the logical trial. He presented the undeniable forensic evidence. He definitively won the argument. But he is now trapped in a house where the ruling class completely refuses to enforce the consequences of that logic.
He is proven completely innocent, yet he remains a prisoner to their desperate need to manage their image.
But as any modern PR executive will tell you, you cannot simply throw dirt over a raging fire and expect it to magically extinguish. The heat remains, and eventually the smoke leaks out. Rumors always leak.
Which brings us to the next massive escalation in the narrative. The governor's attempt to bury the scandal is a complete failure.
A total failure.
Burying a scandal requires a vacuum, and a sprawling, elite ancient household with dozens of servants, guards, and visitors is the exact opposite of a vacuum.
The physics of gossip take over.
Exactly. The whispers leak out from under the locked door and spread like wildfire into the city. And this sets up one of the most famous, and as our sources vigorously argue, one of the most deeply misunderstood scenes in this entire historical text. The banquet of the women.
Okay, let's set the stage for this. The elite socialites, the wealthy women of the city, start whispering amongst themselves. The gossip mill is churning. Have you heard? The governor's wife has completely lost her mind. She is obsessed with her servant. She's infatuated with a young slave.
Which, in that society, isn't just a moral failing, it's a massive class feeling. She is losing face.
She is becoming a laughingstock among her peers.
And in a society built entirely on PR, reputation, and social hierarchy, becoming a joke is a social death sentence. She cannot tolerate it. So she decides she has to take drastic action to seize control of the narrative once again.
So she hatches a plan. She invites all of these gossiping elite women to a lavish, high society banquet at her palatial home. She sets out a massive feast, and crucially, as part of the service, she gives each of these women a knife, presumably to peel or cut the exotic fruits they are being served.
They're all sitting there, knives in hand, ready to enjoy the feast, and probably ready to subtly mock their host.
And then she springs the trap. She orders Yusuf to walk out into the center of the banquet hall. Now, I have to pause here, because I want to talk about how I, and probably most people listening, have always heard this story translated and visualized.
Right, the traditional literal interpretation.
Yeah. The standard telling of this scene always felt like a bizarre horror movie to me. The way it's usually explained is that when these women see Yusuf walk in, they are so overwhelmingly, supernaturally stunned by his physical beauty that they go into a literal hypnotic
They
trance.
lose all sense of physical pain.
Exactly. Their brains short circuit, and instead of slicing their apples or oranges, they literally slice their own hands and fingers open with the sharp knives, bleeding all over the luxurious banquet table without even noticing what they're doing.
Yes, that is the popular, highly dramatic, very bloody visualization that has persisted for centuries. But our source material invites us to take a massive step back, put away the horror movie imagery, and engage in a deep, rigorous linguistic analysis of the original Arabic text.
And I'm so glad they did.
Because when you do that, you realize this isn't a story about physical mutilation at all. It is a profound psychological masterclass.
This was the linguistic deep dive that completely blew my mind. Because when you actually understand the etymology, it changes the entire meaning of the scene from something absurdly gory to something incredibly insightful about human nature. Let's break it down.
It all hinges on the Arabic root word used in the text to describe their action. Kata. Now, in a strict rudimentary literal sense, yes, kata translates to cutting. But language is rarely just literal, especially ancient poetic or historical texts. In the context of Arabic idioms, both ancient and modern, the concept of cutting carries a much broader metaphorical weight.
Right.
The source explains that idiomatically, to cut means to stop, to restrict, to sever a connection, or to paralyze a function.
The source provided some brilliant, highly clarifying examples of this across different contexts. For instance, there's an Arabic phrase about cutting the road. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean someone is out on the highway with a giant pair of scissors snipping the asphalt in half.
Exactly. Cutting the road is a well-known idiom for highway robbery or banditry. It means you are violently stopping the flow of travel. You are paralyzing the route. The function of the road has been severed.
And then there's the idiom of cutting the tongue. Again, this isn't about literal physical amputation or torture. If I say an argument cut his tongue, it means it silenced him.
It severed his ability to speak.
Right, to debate, to continue gossiping. We have similar things in English, right? We say bite your tongue to mean stop talking, or he lost his head to mean he panicked. We don't mean his head physically fell off his shoulders.
Precisely. Idioms rely on the metaphorical transfer of physical action to psychological or functional states. So, when we return to the text, and it says the women cut their hands upon suddenly seeing Yusuf, we must apply this sophisticated idiomatic understanding.
So what does it mean then?
Cutting the hand in this context means paralyzing one's ability to reach out, to act, to maintain fine motor control, or to keep up their composed facade. It means losing their psychological grip.
That was the aha moment for me. They didn't literally amputate their fingers or slice their palms open to the bone. They were holding these knives, ready to act smug and superior.
Right.
Yusuf walks in, and they are so deeply shocked that their hands go slack. They drop the knives, they lose their grip on the utensils, yes, but far more importantly, they lose their psychological grip on their own manufactured, arrogant reality.
We have to ask, what exactly sunned them into this state of paralysis? It wasn't just that he had a handsome face. A handsome face doesn't shatter the psychology of an entire room of elite elites.
Good point.
The text specifically notes their verbal reaction. They gasp and proclaim aloud that he is not a mere mortal man, but a noble angel.
So it's his aura. It's the sheer weight of his presence.
Exactly. Yeah. What paralyzed them was the overwhelming, undeniable force of his character. Think about the psychological mass of a man who has just survived a harrowing, near-death false accusation, who has maintained his absolute, unshakable moral integrity, his Burhan, under extreme duress.
And who completely refuses to be diminished, bowed, or broken by his enslaved status.
He walks into that room, not like a beaten servant, but with absolute dignity, poise, and unshakable presence. That moral gravity is what severed their ability to mock him.
They were psychologically paralyzed by his nobility. They were sitting there, knives in hand, ready to tear apart a scandalous rumor about a dirty servant. But when he appeared, their brains registered the dissonance.
It broke their brains a little bit.
They realized instantly, oh, we were entirely wrong. This isn't some weak-willed servant who can be manipulated or gossiped about. This man is a force of nature. Their hands were rendered useless because their entire arrogant framework for judging the situation and judging him was instantly shattered.
It is a truly profound observation about how genuine, unyielding moral fortitude impacts a highly corrupt, superficial environment. When true integrity walks into a room full of cynical, image-obsessed people, it is blinding. It is destabilizing.
It stops them in their tracks. It cuts their hands.
Exactly.
So paint the picture. The women are stunned into absolute silence. The knives are clattering to the floor. Their gossiping tongues are cut. Their mocking hands are cut. They are sitting there in awe. And the governor's wife is standing at the head of the room, watching this exact reaction unfold. Why did she orchestrate this? What was her actual PR strategy here? What did she gain from this?
It is a masterstroke of dark psychology. The host of the banquet used this elaborate setup to validate her own moral failure.
Validate it.
Yes. By forcing them to witness Yusuf's undeniable, overwhelming presence. Her unspoken message to this elite circle of judgmental women was essentially, see, look at him. You couldn't handle his presence for 5 minutes without dropping your knives and losing your minds.
And I have to live with him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have to live in the same house with this overwhelming presence every single day. You have absolutely no right to sit in your mansions and judge me for slipping.
Wow. It's the ultimate deflection. I failed, yes, but you would have failed too, so you can't condemn me. It's a calculated strategy to normalize her corruption.
Absolutely.
She is using his exceptional angelic character not to elevate herself, but to drag everyone else in her social circle down to her level of excuse. We are all inherently weak when faced with this, so my specific weakness is totally acceptable.
Which leads us directly into a terrifying escalation. What happens when a corrupt system, an entire room of elites, collectively realizes that they cannot ignore the truth?
It's a dangerous moment.
Very. The wife has just publicly validated that Yusuf is exceptional. The women have witnessed it with their own eyes. The lie of the torn shirt, the cover-up by the husband, it is now essentially an open secret among the entire ruling class.
And this is where the wife's attempt at validation turns into a massive, terrifying collective threat against Yusuf's rationality and his freedom. This brings us to the final act of this deep dive, the actual social physics of the situation.
Emboldened by the fact that the other women were just as overwhelmed and paralyzed as she was, the wife feels vindicated. She drops all remaining pretense of secrecy or shame.
She's not hiding anymore.
She transitions from trying to violently cover up the crime in a locked room to openly, brazenly admitting it in a crowded banquet hall.
She stands there in front of all her peers and issues a chilling public ultimatum. She says basically, yes, I tried to seduce him and he refused me, I admit it, but hear me now. If he does not do what I order him to do moving forward, he will surely be imprisoned and he will be humiliated.
The text highlights a crucial, subtle shift here in the grammar of the narrative. The pronouns change. Yusuf recognizes that the dynamic has fundamentally mutated. He prays and he says, my lord, prison is more beloved to me than that to which they invite me. Notice the plural. They.
They. It's no longer just the governor's wife aggressively pursuing him in a locked room.
No, it's the entire room.
It's the entire banquet hall. It's the whispers, the stares, the expectations. It is the entire elite social system leaning on him. They're all looking at him. And the unspoken, crushing pressure is immense. The system is collectively telling him, just play the game. Comply. Give in to the corruption. Make this easy for all of us so we don't have to look at our own flaws.
He is facing the crushing, suffocating weight of systemic peer pressure. The entire culture is inviting him to abandon his Burhan, his internal moral compass, to make their lives more comfortable. And the source points out his profound, deeply relatable human vulnerability in this exact moment.
Right, because he doesn't just brush it off.
Because he doesn't stand there like a superhero and say, I am a prophet, I'm immune, I could easily deflect all of you.
No, he is terrified. He admits how incredibly close to the edge he is. He prays that if God doesn't avert their snare, their collective plotting, he might actually incline toward them and be among the ignorant. The source connects his fear here to a very specific Arabic word, asbu. I want to dig into that because the psychology is fascinating. What does asbu actually mean in this context?
Asbu is a term that deeply relates to the behavior and psychology of a child.
Yeah.
It implies acting childishly, emotionally, purely on impulse, completely abandoning reason.
Like a tantrum.
Sort of. Think about a child who is relentlessly badgered or pressured.
Yeah.
Eventually they throw a tantrum where they just completely give up and comply, entirely abandoning logic just to make the sensory overload stop.
Just to get some peace.
Yes. Yusuf is recognizing his own human limits. He is saying that if this relentless, massive psychological pressure from the entire elite class continues day after day, his logical mind, his highly trained Burhan, might become exhausted. He might suffer moral burnout. He fears he might revert to an Isboo state, giving in to the corruption, not out of genuine desire, but just to make the relentless pressure stop, like an exhausted child finally complying with the bully just to get a moment of peace.
That is so incredibly relatable. Think about you, the listener. Think about the exhausting, bone-wearying reality of being the only ethical person in a highly corrupt company or a toxic family environment.
It takes a toll.
Day after day, you hold the line. You refuse to fudge the quarterly numbers. You refuse to lie to the clients. You refuse to participate in the toxic gossip. But every single person around you is doing it. And worse, they are looking at you like you are the problem. You are the wet blanket making them feel guilty.
You become the villain in their story.
Eventually, the daily friction wears you down. You suffer deep decision fatigue. The temptation isn't even necessarily the corrupt act itself anymore. The temptation is simply the profound relief of surrender. Just saying, fine, whatever, I'll sign the document, I'll look the other way, just to stop having to fight the entire system every single day.
Exactly. The system isn't trying to outsmart him anymore. It is trying to erode his rationality through sheer grinding attrition. But this leads us to the absolute climax of the social physics we've been tracking. Because while Yusuf is feeling the pressure, the elite class is actually the one in a massive bind.
They have a huge dilemma. Let's look at the board from the governor's perspective. They have seen the absolute undeniable forensic proof of his innocence, the torn shirt. They know for a fact he is a man of extreme integrity. They have all personally witnessed his noble character paralyzing the women at the banquet.
But his continued presence walking the halls of that palace is a massive walking indictment of their entire way of life.
It's a mirror.
Every single time they look at him, they are vividly reminded of their own moral decay. They are reminded of the wife's guilt. They are reminded of the husband's cowardice in burying the truth. They are reminded of the women dropping their knives in awe. He is a perfectly clean mirror reflecting their absolute ugliness back at them.
They can't logically defeat him because he has the physical evidence. And they realize they can't morally corrupt him quickly enough because his Burhan has held incredibly strong against both the intense temptation in the locked room and the massive threats in the banquet hall.
So they have to find another way.
Right. So from a sociological standpoint, what is a corrupt system's final desperate move when it can neither logically disprove the truth nor morally absorb it?
It physically isolates it. The source explains the cold calculus of the ruling class. They huddle together and make a decision. Despite knowing his absolute innocence, they decide to imprison him for a time.
Just sweep him away.
Notice the phrasing. It wasn't about delivering justice. It was purely about removing the irritant. They had to lock away the undeniable truth, bury it in a dark hole, because acknowledging it openly would destroy their fragile social fabric and their PR image.
They literally put the truth in a dungeon so they could go back to living their comfortable, luxurious lives without feeling guilty. But here is the ultimate twist of this entire deep dive, the profound insight that the source leaves us with. The physical prison is not actually a punishment for Yusuf.
Not at all. If we look closely at the phrasing of his prayer, prison is more beloved to me than that to which they invite me, we see a radical shift in agency. He actively, intentionally chose it.
He chose it.
In the face of a deeply toxic environment that threatened to wear down his logic through attrition and force him into a childish, as-beaut compliance, the prison ceases to be a place of punishment. It becomes a sanctuary.
A sanctuary. That is incredible. He's literally choosing a dark, cold, isolated dungeon over a luxurious, powerful palace because he realizes that the palace is actually a prison for his soul, and the dungeon is a fortress for his mind. He chooses severe physical confinement to protect his absolute moral freedom.
It is a radical, breathtaking reframing of what imprisonment means. The corrupt system thinks it is punishing him. They think they have won by removing him from the board. But he is actually using their own punitive mechanism to completely escape their psychological warfare.
He protects his Burhan.
Right, his internal operating system, by physically removing himself from the source of the toxicity, even if it costs him his physical liberty, his comfort, and the sun on his face.
Okay, we need to take a deep breath because we have covered incredible, dense ground today.
We really have.
Let's wrap up this journey for everyone listening. We started by opening the door to a locked room 3,000 years ago. We analyzed the internal mechanics of morality, seeing how an internalized law, that Burhan, the visceral understanding of the poison of built-in consequences, infinitely trumps any external policing or mechanical chanting.
We watch forensic logic and the irrefutable physics of a torn shirt triumph over manipulation in a closed-door trial.
We unpacked the rich linguistic idioms of an ancient culture, realizing that cutting hands wasn't a slasher film horror scene, but a profound psychological illustration of an elite society completely losing its grip in the presence of unshakable, blinding integrity.
And finally, we witness the cold, calculating social physics of a corrupt society that will always, inevitably attempt to lock away the undeniable truth when that truth becomes too inconvenient to their PR strategy and their status quo.
Yusuf won the logic, he won the morality, but the system locked him in a dungeon anyway.
But as we know from the broader narrative, the story absolutely does not end in the silence of that cell.
That's right. This is just the teaser for our next deep dive into this material. Yusuf is entering the physical confines of the dungeon. The door is locking behind him. But he is not going in as a defeated victim, broken and chewed up by the system.
He is about to turn that dark, isolated prison into a vibrant university of the mind.
That dungeon is where his logic, his unique ability to interpret the deepest truths, like the meaning of dreams, and his unshakable Burhan will gestate and grow until they eventually become the tools that bring the entire Egyptian empire to its knees.
It is a powerful reminder that violently locking away the truth doesn't destroy it. It often just gives it the quiet time it needs to sharpen into a weapon. Which leaves us with a final vital thought to mull over today, building on everything we've discussed about evidence, PR, and internal moral compasses.
What's the ultimate takeaway for the listener to carry with them?
Think deeply about the torn shirts in your own life. Identify those undeniable pieces of evidence, those clear, glaring truths about a situation, a relationship, or a workplace that you, or the institutions around you, have actively chosen to ignore simply because acknowledging them would be socially, financially, or professionally inconvenient.
Right, the things we just sweep under the rug.
When you are faced with the murky waters of human behavior, are you bravely enforcing the truth even when it costs you? Or are you, like the governor, just desperately trying to manage the PR?
Are you demanding the clear, jagged white line of the X-ray to guide your actions, or are you just throwing dirt on the muddy waters, hoping nobody ever notices the mess you buried? Until next time, keep diving deep.